Involuntary unemployment. On a free market, there is no involuntary unemployment. There is frictional unemployment and voluntary unemployment. Frictional unemployment is when people are moving and searching for jobs. Right? They're going through the classifieds, interviewing, right, or moving to a new place where the job will be at. Right? They're in transition. Involuntary unemployment is when a person is willing to work at a certain wage and an employer is willing to pay that certain wage, but the employment does not occur for some reason. The worker is able to show up and do the labor. The employer is willing to pay the wage, but the employment does not occur. Now, on a free market, this is impossible, so we are told. Because if you are willing to work for low enough, you should always find work on a free market. This may mean working for 2 cents an hour, but there are jobs you can choose to work at. If you are unwilling to work for 2 cents an hour, then you are voluntarily unemployed. You would rather not work than work for 2 cents an hour. Keynes believed there was involuntary unemployment on a free market because in the year 1936, there was involuntary unemployment in the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, the reason there was involuntary unemployment in the U.S. is obvious, right? There was minimum wage laws which existed at the state level, and unions had the legal power to enforce minimum wages in certain industries, right? That is, it wasn't a free market, and I assume doubly goes true for the UK at the time. And as a result, wages were not allowed to fall. It was illegal to work for below a certain wage. Right? No, you couldn't work for 2 cents an hour. If wages were allowed to fall, then we could say that anyone not working was voluntarily unemployed because there will always be someone willing to hire you for 1 cent an hour. If you don't want to work for 1 cent an hour, then you are choosing to be unemployed. Now, I don't think there would actually be any people working for 1 cent an hour on a free market. I'm just defining what involuntary unemployment really means. Keynes, however, ignored the existence of minimum wage laws and proceeded to make up a theory that stated that employment was determined by aggregate demand. He claimed that a rise in nominal wages on a free market will lead to a rise in consumption, okay? But not by as much as the rise in wages, and thus will lead to a downward spiral with firms laying off workers due to decreased consumptions, right? Workers get more money. Let's say they get $100 per person, they're only going to spend $90 per person. Thus, firms now only have $90 to pay their workers, and thus you get the supposed downward spiral, right? Because firms don't lower prices and they don't lower wages, right? So, yeah. From page 26 of Keynes's The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, Keynes says, when unemployment increases, aggregate real income is increased. The psychology of the community is such that when aggregate real income is increased, aggregate consumption is increased, but not by so much as income. Hence, employers would make a loss if the whole of the increased employment were to be devoted to satisfying the increased demand for immediate consumption. And then on page 28 he says, the insufficiency of effective demand will inhibit the process of production in spite of the fact that the marginal product of labor still exceeds the marginal disutility of employment. Close quote. In other words, even if people are willing to work and people are willing to hire, and a wage is agreed upon, and it would be profitable to employ a person, right, and the person is in the area willing to work, has work boots on and everything, and the employer has the cash on hand ready to employ him and has a task that needs to be done, employment won't occur. Remember, marginal product of labor can only come from a product, and this product only has value if it meets extant demand. Thus, this statement is not only false in actuality, right? Consumption doesn't determine employment. That's retarded. It is definitionally false. But this is what Keynes is saying. Even though people want to work and produce things and work at low wages instead of no wages so that the firms they work at can earn a small profit, it won't happen because of insufficient consumption. Henry Hazlitt, in his response to Keynes's theory, was similarly in disbelief that such clearly and obviously false ideas could be so successful. But this makes sense when we recognize that Keynes's book was published in 1936, right in the middle of what I like to refer as the Age of the State, which lasted roughly from 1913 to 1948. And Keynes rationalized what states were already doing and blaming their manifest failure on the little freedom that remained. Keynes was nothing more than a court intellectual, and his book is poor in both form and content, and only became big because Keynes was so enthusiastic in his licking of the spittle and caked on blood on the boot of the state. The inverse of Keynes's notion that contraction in the money supply leads to a downward spiral is that an expansion of the money supply leads to an upward spiral. That is, when aggregate demand is stimulated, right? Aggregate demand is stimulated, people spend more money, and firms thus have more money with which to pay workers and buy more capital. And this has a multiplier effect, according to Keynes, because if you give one person $1, you will spend part of it giving it to someone. Then someone will spend part of it giving it to someone else, etc. Now, people will hoard some of this money, leading to the downward spiral, and so the money supply needs to keep being expanded constantly. What they ignore is that the first person given the dollar, in effect, had a portion of society's extant resources transferred to him. But let's assume there are 10 resources and $10. Right? 10 resources and $10, and each dollar is used to represent a resource. If Bob suddenly has 10 additional dollars poofed into existence, that increases the money supply by 100%. Right? There are now $20 instead of $10, but there are still only 10 resources. And so all that ends up happening is that Bob, with his $10, can now command half of the extant economy. Similarly, when you give people money to spend, all that does is make each individual dollar worth less, and in effect transfers resources to the people who were given the money, along with the disintegrative effects elucidated earlier. Right, artificial expansion, right, leads to booms and busts. Thus, the Bush-Obama bailouts simply amounted to a transfer of real resources from you to antisocial firms. But if you really want to know about Keynesian economics, I would recommend reading these two books side by side. The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money by John Maynard Keynes, and The Failure of the New Economics by Henry Hazlitt. Hazlitt goes through Keynes's book chapter by chapter, so you can read one chapter by Keynes and then one chapter by Hazlitt, etc. And the links to these two books, and you can get these two books for free. The links to them will be in the description on YouTube, or will be to the source page if you're like reading this on the podcast. However, you're accessing this. One last quote, and I believe this requires no editorialization. Keynes says, quote, "If the Treasury were to fill old bottles with banknotes, bury them at suitable depths in disused coal mines, which are then filled up to the surface with towed rubbish, and leave it to private enterprise on well-tried principles of laissez-faire to dig up the notes again, the right to do so being obtained, of course, by tendering for leases of the note-bearing territory, there need be no more unemployment, and with the help of the repercussions, the real income of the community, and its capital wealth also, would probably become a good deal greater than it actually is. It would indeed be more sensible to build houses and the like, but if there are political and practical difficulties in the way of this, the above would be better than nothing."